we've got lives and I've got children, and you know, the effort that we put in, because we work really hard, we're starting to pale a little, you know. And you know, we always thank Paul to this day. Because of Paul, who was the workaholic of our band, we made a lot more records than John and I would have made, say.
Most people think the Beatles broke up because of one reason, and that's understandable, because it's the story we've all heard for decades. But the truth is far more complicated. And now, 85-year-old Ringo Starr is revealing that the band's collapse wasn't caused by a single person or a single moment. Behind the music were death threats, bitter internal battles, impossible choices, and scars that followed him long after the final song was played. What really happened behind closed doors, and why has so much of Ringo's side of the story remained untold until now? Today, we uncover the unfiltered truth behind the man who kept the Beatles' heart beating. The boy from Dingle. Most people assume Ringo Starr's biggest struggles began with Beatlemania. The truth is, they started the day he was born. On July 7, 1940, Richard Starkey entered the world in Dingle, one of Liverpool's poorest and toughest neighborhoods, where survival often came before dreams. His parents, Richard Starkey Sr. and Elsie Gleave, shared a love of music and dancing, spending their evenings in local ballrooms and hoping to build a happy life together. But those dreams unraveled almost as soon as Richie arrived, setting him on a path defined by hardship long before fame ever found him. Elsie became fiercely devoted to her only child, while his father slowly drifted away. The nights out stopped, the marriage unraveled, and by 1944, when Richie was just 4 years old, his parents had divorced. From that point on, he was raised almost entirely by his mother, with only scattered memories of the father who had largely disappeared from his life. And his life only got more difficult from there. At the age of 6, Richie was rushed to the hospital for what doctors believed would be a routine appendix operation. Instead of being healed, complications led to peritonitis, a serious infection that spread through his abdomen and nearly claimed his life. And what should have been a short hospital stay turned into an entire year of recovery. While other children were learning in classrooms and playing in the streets, Richie was confined to a hospital bed, watching the outside world move on without him. By the time he returned home, he had fallen badly behind in school and lost touch with many of the friends he had once known. Yet even during those long months in hospital, there were glimpses of the personality that would later make millions of people love him. Nurses remembered him as cheerful and quick to smile despite everything he was going through. To help entertain the children, hospital staff encouraged them to make music, and Richie instinctively began tapping rhythms on anything within reach: tables, cupboards, bed frames, anything that made a sound. He couldn't have known it then, but those simple rhythms would go on to shape the rest of his life. But sadly, his life didn't immediately turn out to be rhythm and blues, because just a few years later, tragedy struck again. In 1953, Richie was diagnosed with tuberculosis and returned to the hospital, where he would spend nearly 2 more years recovering in a children's sanatorium. Once again, he was separated from the life most children took for granted. Once again, music became his escape. This time, his interest centered almost entirely on drums. While many young people dreamed of becoming singers or guitarists, Richie found himself drawn to rhythm. The drums gave him something illness never could: a sense of control. By the time he finally returned home, his education had suffered beyond repair. Years spent in hospital meant he left school with few qualifications and little interest in following a traditional career. But he didn't care. Instead, he threw himself into the one thing that had remained constant through every setback: music. Around this time, Another important figure entered his life. His mother had married Harry Graves, a kind and dependable man who became the father Ritchie had been missing for most of his childhood. Harry introduced him to big band records, encouraged his growing love of drumming, and provided the stability that had been absent during his early years. Looking back, it's remarkable how much of Ringo Starr's character was shaped long before the Beatles ever existed. Years of illness had taught him patience. Growing up without his father had made him appreciate loyalty, and surviving childhood had given him a calmness that would later become invaluable inside one of the most famous and often most turbulent bands in music history. Those difficult years prepared him for a life no one else could have imagined. But before the world knew him as Ringo Starr, he still had to find his place in Liverpool's growing music scene. With little more than determination, a second-hand drum kit, and a dream that seemed almost impossible. Biscuit tins and dark alleys. The neighborhood Ringo grew up in was not the kind of place that produced many success stories. It possessed a bunch of small, crumbling houses, limited opportunities, and a culture of simply getting by. In line with this culture, Ringo worked a string of jobs during his teenage years, none of which held his attention for long. He tried the railways. He tried waiting tables. He even eventually landed an apprenticeship as a machinist, which at least offered some stability. But during lunch breaks at the plant, he and his friend Roy Trafford would slip away to a small local club called The Cellar, where Ringo would improvise rhythms on whatever was available. A box, a biscuit tin, or even the back of a chair. It was not a glamorous sight, but it was enough for both of them. The two of them eventually pulled together a small group with a neighbor named Eddie Miles, and they started playing the skiffle music that was sweeping through working-class Britain at the time. Ringo added texture by scraping a thimble across a washboard. He loved dancing as much as drumming and had even taken dance lessons with Roy, the two of them trying to sharpen their moves for nights out. It was all very informal, very local, and very far from anything that looked like a future. But everything changed on 1957's Christmas Day, when his stepfather Harry gave him his first proper drum kit. It was second-hand, basic, and held together more by goodwill than by engineering. A snare drum, a bass drum, and a makeshift cymbal fashioned from a rubbish bin lid. But Ringo did not care. He threw himself into it completely. And within a short period of time, his playing improved fast enough that the band started getting real bookings around Liverpool. And by November 1959, he had made a decision that would set his life on its new course. He joined Al Caldwell's Texans, a group that was moving away from skiffle and toward proper rock and roll. The band went through several name changes before settling on Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and it was around this time that Richard Starkey became Ringo Starr, a name inspired by the rings he wore and the country western sound he admired. His solo spot during the Hurricanes shows, which the crowd came to know as Star Time, became one of the most anticipated parts of every performance. And by early 1969, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes were one of the most popular live acts in Liverpool. A 3-month residency at a holiday camp in Wales that summer forced Ringo to make a genuinely difficult choice. Taking the gig meant walking away from his machinist apprenticeship after nearly 5 years. But he didn't waver. That decision, made by a young man with no qualifications and nothing but a second-hand drum kit and a growing reputation, turned out to be the most important one he ever made. What happened next was the kind of coincidence that only makes sense in hindsight, because it put Ringo Starr in the same room as 3 young men from Liverpool who were also about to change the world. The night he met the Beatles. On October 1st, 1969, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes arrived at the Kaiserkeller Club in Hamburg, Germany, to find another Liverpool band sharing the bill with them. The The Hurricanes were the headliners. The other group, still relatively unknown and still finding their footing, played the opening slot. Their name was the Beatles. Ringo met John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison that night. He was friendly with them, played the odd session with them during the Hamburg stint, and made enough of an impression that a musician named Tony Sheridan tried to recruit him away from the Hurricanes altogether. And although Ringo stayed put for the time being, the connection had been made. And on October 15, 1960, he sat in with the Beatles for the first time, playing drums on a recording of Summertime. Nobody present had any idea what they were actually watching begin. In January 1962, after one more season with the Hurricanes, the call Ringo had not quite dared to expect finally came. John Lennon rang him personally and asked him to join the Beatles. 2 days after that call, the band's manager, Brian Epstein, sat down with the existing drummer, Pete Best, and delivered the news that the band had decided to move in a different direction. And just like that, Best was out, and Ringo was in. The reaction from Pete Best's fan base was hostile. On Ringo's first night at the Cavern Club, fans were outside chanting "Pete forever, Ringo never." George Harrison was punched by an angry supporter. Brian Epstein even had to arrange personal protection for Ringo just to get him safely through the early weeks. It was not the warmest of welcomes, and the uncertainty did not stop there. When the band went into the studio in September 1962 to record their debut single, producer George Martin quietly brought in a session drummer named Andy White, leaving Ringo to play tambourine. Standing at the side of the studio shaking a tambourine while someone else sat at his drum kit, Ringo admitted later that he genuinely thought it was happening again, that they were about to tell him he was not good enough. Martin clarified that it had simply been a precaution. By November of that year, the fans had fully accepted Ringo as one of their own. Some were already asking for him to sing. What came next was something none of them, including Ringo, had any framework for understanding, because nothing quite like it had ever happened before. Beatlemania and what it cost. By 1963, the Beatles were the biggest thing Britain had ever produced in popular music, and Ringo was right at the center of it. Fans wore "I Love Ringo" lapel pins. Radio stations played songs written in his honor. His deadpan humor and natural warmth made him a favorite in interviews, and his performances in the band's first film, A Hard Day's Night, earned him genuine critical praise. When the Beatles crossed the Atlantic in February 1964 to appear on The Ed Sullivan Show, 73 million Americans watched. Ringo later said that seeing all those kids waving for him felt completely unbelievable. They had been, in his words, just ordinary lads, and somehow they had made it. But Beatlemania had a hidden cost that was not visible from the outside. In the same year, while preparing for a world tour, Ringo collapsed with severe tonsillitis and pharyngitis and had to miss 5 concerts. A session drummer named Jimmy Nicole temporarily took his place, and Ringo admitted privately that he was terrified it was the beginning of the end for him inside the band. And even though he rejoined in Melbourne and the tour continued, the pressure was building on all of them. Before a show in Montreal, Ringo received a specific death threat, serious enough that he positioned his cymbals vertically during the performance for physical protection. By 1966, all 4 of them had had enough of touring. They stopped entirely, retreating into the studio to focus on themselves. For Ringo, the shift into pure studio work brought its own complications. As Lennon and McCartney's grip on the creative direction tightened, Ringo found himself feeling more like a hired session player than a founding member of the group. He was playing what he was told to play, waiting in corridors while other parts of songs were recorded, and watching the band he loved slowly become something more complicated and divided than the group of mates who had arrived in Hamburg with nothing but energy and ambition years ago. In 1968, during the recording of what would become known as the White Album, it finally became too much. McCartney's control over sessions had become suffocating. The tension between Lennon and Harrison had turned the studio into an uncomfortable place to be, and as a result, Ringo packed up and left. He spent 2 weeks away, sailing in the Mediterranean and eventually writing a song called Octopus's Garden while sitting on a boat, thinking about fish. When he came back, he found his drum kit covered in flowers that George Harrison had placed there as a welcome. It was a generous gesture and a genuinely touching one. But Ringo knew, as they all did, that flowers could not fix what was actually breaking. Yes, the White Album sessions were difficult, but the sessions that came next, during the Let It Be recordings in 1969, were way worse. And at the center of it, Ringo now says, was a presence that changed the room every time she walked into it. What Ringo said about Yoko. For more than 50 years, people have argued over what really brought the Beatles to an end. Some point to business disputes, others blame creative differences. The death of manager Brian Epstein in 1967, or the growing tension between John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison. The truth is that the band's breakup was never caused by a single event. It was the result of years of pressure, changing priorities, and relationships that had slowly begun to shift. Ringo Starr has always been careful when talking about that period, but now, in his 80s, he has become more willing to reflect on what he witnessed from inside the room. And one subject he no longer avoids is Yoko Ono. By the time work began on the White Album, Yoko had become a constant presence in the recording studio. She would sit beside John Lennon during sessions, something that had never really happened before with any of the Beatles' partners. For a band that had spent years treating the studio as a private creative space, shared only by the four of them, and a small group of trusted staff, the change was impossible to ignore. Ringo has said that this was when the atmosphere inside the group began to change. Conversations became more guarded. The easy rhythm they had developed after years of working together started to disappear, and what had once felt like four friends making music increasingly felt like separate people pulling in different directions. From Ringo's perspective, the issue was never simply Yoko herself. It was what her presence represented. John and Yoko had become inseparable, and that naturally changed the balance inside the band. Decisions that had once happened through conversation between four equals became more complicated. George Harrison later spoke about feeling overlooked creatively, while Paul McCartney became increasingly determined to keep the group moving forward. Ringo often found himself caught somewhere in the middle, trying to keep the peace while watching the unity that had once defined the Beatles slowly fade away. Even so, Ringo has repeatedly resisted the idea that Yoko alone broke up the Beatles. In later interviews, he has acknowledged that deeper problems were already there. Personal ambitions had changed. Creative interests were pulling each member in different directions. Financial disagreements were becoming harder to resolve. Yoko's presence may have highlighted those tensions, but it did not create all of them. By the late 1960s, while the Beatles were already beginning to outgrow the partnership that had carried them to worldwide fame, Ringo was dealing with struggles of his own. His battle with alcoholism became increasingly serious during the years that followed the band's breakup. Looking back, he has admitted the mistakes he made, the damage alcohol caused, and how difficult it was to find stability after the structure of the Beatles disappeared. For years, the band had given him purpose, routine, and the feeling of belonging to something bigger than himself. Losing that affected him more deeply than many people realized. But, thankfully, that wasn't where his story ended. Ringo eventually got sober. He built a successful solo career, found lasting happiness with Barbara Bach, and discovered a new appreciation for the extraordinary life he had lived. Today, When he speaks about the Beatles, there is very little bitterness in his voice. Instead, there is gratitude. Gratitude for the music they created, the friendships they shared, and the chance to have been part of something that changed popular culture forever. So when people ask him about Yoko today, his answer is more balanced than many expect. He doesn't offer dramatic accusations or place all the blame on one person. Instead, he describes what he saw: a band whose relationships were already changing, made even more complicated by a new dynamic inside the studio. A story of four extraordinary musicians growing apart under pressures that few people could ever fully understand. More than half a century later, perhaps that is Ringo Starr's most important message. The Beatles didn't end because of one argument, one decision, or one person. They ended because even the closest friendships can change. What remains is not the conflict itself, but the music they left behind, and the memories of the people who were there to witness it. What part of Ringo Starr's journey surprised you the most? Do you think the Beatles' breakup could ever have been avoided, or was it inevitable? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.